This is Roadshow, Destinations in Business Innovation. I'm Tom Alexander. In this installment of Roadshow, the destination is Pole City, Brooklyn, New York. Brooklyn, New York, the home of the historic Brooklyn Navy Yard, and New Lab, a business incubator that brings together entrepreneurs and engineers with industry and government to apply innovation to pressing challenges in energy, mobility, and materials. Today, we're visiting with Paul Johnson, CEO and founder of Pole City. Pole City is a hub that allows business communities to build powerful local supply chains, supported by advances in automation and machine learning. Well, Paul, thanks for having us. We really appreciate it. We're happy to spend some time, even if it's just virtually. Now, I want to get right into it. On your website, you state that Pole City isn't just a platform, it's part of a revolutionary transformation. If you can, what do you mean by this?
Well, there's been a lot of changes in manufacturing and supply post-COVID, and I think a lot of people experience supply chain disruptions and et cetera in their lives. And what's happening now is a lot of businesses that previously used to outsource materials or supplies have found alternatives to working locally. And part of this is technologically driven. And part of it is just that these companies want to diversify their business models. And I think another component is new requirements regarding things like sustainability. So if you're sourcing things locally, if you're manufacturing things locally, that's an intrinsically more sustainable model because of the shorter supply chains. So I would say that those are three factors that are causing a really remarkable shift towards regionalization.
Paul Johnson is an experienced software engineer and entrepreneur who has designed, developed, and deployed multiple SaaS platforms for Fortune 500 companies and startups alike. He was involved in the development of an event management platform used for Walmart, Google, and Monster, and was a pioneer in ad tech. And what would you say was the catalyst for starting Pole City, and did your background inform this a bit?
Well, yeah, at the time we came up with the idea of Pole City, I was actually involved in migrating an enterprise procurement platform that connected several of manufacturers in the Midwest and managed several hundred millions of dollars of orders annually. And while I was working on this, the pandemic hit, and we're based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. And a lot of businesses within the Navy Yard organically just pivoted what they normally did and started manufacturing PPE. This was very interesting because the project that I was working with at the time was a cohort of manufacturers in the Midwest that have managed to survive through offshoring. And they did this by pulling together, by working together, by providing like a procurement catalog, which they could then source to local manufacturers. And this was happening organically in the Brooklyn Navy Yard all by itself. And it happened in response to, an externality like COVID. But you saw how if the conditions were to change, not only would there be a capacity to do this in a normal way, but there'd be all sorts of benefits associated with it. So we started helping businesses during that time. And in the process of operationalizing them, we started to invest more and more in development of the platform in anticipation of changes that would come. So these kind of things came together, our existing work and the direction we went.
Yeah. And what problem or problems were you looking to solve?
Well, one of the things that we heard again and again from businesses. So we would talk to a business, and we're based in the Brooklyn Navy Yard, which is a geofenced community. So there's like 700 businesses there all in one place. And you would think with that kind of density, there would be lots of chatter and understanding of what was going on there, but there actually wasn't. And we would talk to a business and they'd say, well, we're all set up to source things from China, or we source things from the other side of the country or some other place in the city. And then we found out that there's a guy downstairs that's been doing this for 30 years. So we heard this kind of story and different versions of this story 100 times. And we began to realize that this community would benefit from some sort of directory service, a master parts and service list that would provide real-time information on inventories within the community. And this would have to be better than just some kind of like listing service, because you'd have to actually understand availability and integrate different kinds of workflows. So as we first started trying to organize a master parts and service list, we realized that there were a lot of things we had to operationalize. And in the process of doing that, we began to understand a lot of the technological changes and opportunities associated with getting these workflows to work. And the platform became all of these things. And in many ways, solving these problems cut across different kinds, traditional silos of, inventory management or fulfillment or directory services or service leasing. So we had to create a platform that would manage or orchestrate different businesses within a locale. And so one of the core ideas of Pulse City is a focus on locality and proximity and creating efficient workflows within a community.
Maybe a stealth version of project management.
There's an aspect of that, except for it's more specific. There are things that, the platform has to do in terms of, things like inventory control and procurement and fulfillment statuses and transactions. And so there's actual operational things rather than just, assigning tasks and checking boxes.
You speak about place-based efficiencies. In today's virtual world, each link in a supply chain can be based just about anywhere. What are the benefits that are unlocked when you're able to work together under one roof?
Yeah, and it doesn't even necessarily have to be under one roof, because actually, the Navy Yard is quite big. And we're also talking to other communities outside of the Navy Yard. For example, Dumbo, which is a community that's just about a mile and a half away or a mile away from the Brooklyn Navy Yard.
Dumbo is an acronym for Down Under the Manhattan Bridge Overpass. It's nestled between the Brooklyn Bridge, Bridge Street, York Street, and the East River, and is home to a vibrant arts and tech startup community.
The advantages for this is that, there's lots of things. First of all, it's very efficient. So if you need a particular inventory or service, it's just all easier to walk across the street to get it as opposed to order it, if you can actually get good information concerning availability. But there's also unique opportunities so that you don't necessarily want to or make sense to expose to the wider world. So, for example, within the Brooklyn Navy Yard, there's a lot of scenic companies for major, television production that will use 3/4-inch plywood. But there's also furniture manufacturers that may have use for their scrap. There are metal workers who are using laser cutting to cut all sorts of really complex designs and structures for architecture and furniture and et cetera. And the laser cutters will also produce scrap. And what's also interesting about that is the machines that do the laser cutting automatically catalog all of this information. So providing information on things like waste stream and scrap information can provide a lot of value to the immediate community, and it doesn't necessarily make sense to sort of start sticking that stuff up on an Etsy site or something. That's one example. But if you're also thinking in terms of, Dumbo and the Brooklyn Navy Yard, these are communities that have their own kind of sort of place-based ecosystem, and the ability that one could source from the other very conveniently not only is efficient, but provides a certain value for the locale itself. So if you look at a place like Dumbo, Dumbo has a lot of mixed use, a lot of creative office, mixed use, certain kinds of stores, fair amount of artists in production, and et cetera. But from the perspective of the community, they want to have a sort of distinct place-based advantage, to have a reason for businesses to be located there. And this becomes part of that answer.
If you would, tell us about some of the companies that you've, and you'll pardon the expression, Pulse City has pulled in.
So one company that we worked with is called Farah Design, and that's I think it's a very interesting case because Farah moved into the Navy Yard decades ago when the Navy Yard was in a very different state. It was very run down and kind of ruinous. And at that time, Robert Farroni, I believe, who was the founder of Farah Design, actually built a foundry. And he would, cast his own furniture and metalwork. And over time, he's started using laser cutting and advanced manufacturing techniques, and he's doing some really sophisticated stuff now. And this is an example how traditional, artisans and makers of handicrafts are evolving to a state where they can do these small customized runs efficiently and economically. And there's more and more of that capacity that's starting to happen, which is also a target of our platform. Another interesting story like that is Bednark. Bednark was really important during COVID. They're a fabrication studio, and they've done really impressive kind of one of a kind fabrication projects. If you ever wander into a hotel and you see like an Airstream trailer that's been converted into a bar, or some kind of fabulous sculptural like Super Bowl construction, a company like Bednark does that kind of work. But in order to sort of have this flexible capability to sort of make anything for any kind of application, they use these really flexible kinds of tools, which also meant that when COVID hit, they could turn out 1 million face shields, for example. And they're also involved with Pole City. So we've also worked with some smaller woodworkers and, many, many other businesses. We're also in conversations with different business communities across Brooklyn. Brooklyn has a really unique ecosystem where there's lots of applications for our model, but I think this is true in cities across the country.
Speaking of Brooklyn, do you plan on expanding this model beyond Brooklyn? If so, where?
One of the big challenges right now is there's a lot of discussion about reshoring manufacturing in the United States. And there's some high profile example like the chips factories, like they're building in upstate New York. And I believe there's several out in the Southwest to manufacture microchips and et cetera in the United States, semiconductors. But the thing is building these sort of big industrial facilities like that, your sort of giant gigafactory type of models, there's not a lot of sites where things like that can happen, or to get the kind of capital to put something like that together takes a lot of something to happen. I mean, it takes a lot of investment and energy and talent and access to infrastructure. And there's not a lot of places that you can check all the boxes and have everything line up where that can happen. But what you do have is lots and lots of really diverse topologies of manufacturing, creative services, artisanal production, local distribution options that actually, if you can organize and orchestrate in an efficient way, represent high volume, high scale of manufactured goods, services, and et cetera. And so I think this is true in cities, particularly throughout the Northeast, which were the traditional manufacturing centers of the United States. These places have been built on generally on a sort of smaller footprint where proximity works really well. And they also have certain kinds of infrastructure investments that are good. It's a lot easier to sort of modernize and upgrade those as opposed to build them from scratch on a sort of later sort of city that's more sprawled out. But I also think that there's a revolution happening in mobility in which Pole City would fit on top of in a lot of these more spread out places as well. But so basically the short answer is I think any urban place in the United States and maybe the world, Pole City could fit.
Absolutely fascinating. And Pole City, the name, where did that originate?
Well, the idea of pulling together. So that's kind of how we felt at the time when COVID hit, is we had to pull together. And it was scary. It was, New York City was the epicenter of the pandemic. Nobody really knew what that meant. People didn't really understand it.
Hardly a reference point for that, right?
Yeah. And people were expecting dire things to happen in a place like New York where there was such density and possibilities for contagion. But the fact that we turned it around and we could get all the supplies that we could was an inspiration.
Sure sounds it. And the work that you're doing is just amazing. Wonderful. One last important question I have for you, Paul. Where would I find the best pizza in Brooklyn? Now, a friend swears by Luigi's in Park Slope, but maybe you have a different suggestion.
Yeah, do I have a Pole City recommendation?
Yes, a Pole City recommendation.
So what I would really recommend is to just take a train somewhere out in South Brooklyn and get off of it and wander into a random pizzeria and take a chance. And I find that some of the best pizza that I've gotten have had in Brooklyn have completely surprised me.
That's great. And that is often the case. I can't say I've done that in Brooklyn proper, but I have done that in Manhattan and have almost always stumbled onto something pretty great. Our guest today, Paul Johnson from Pool City, Brooklyn, New York. This is Roadshow. I'm Tom Alexander.